Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.
On this episode of Defense News Weekly, shipbuilding in the Navy. Get an inside look at how the deals to make America's warships are made and what that means for you. Plus, we talk to a Maverick commander who was booted from his ship after taking a stand for his crew. And satellite wars. What is the Pentagon doing about security between military and commercial satellites? We discuss just that. And finally, the Army's first new combat vehicle in nearly 40 years gets a name. We've got a lot to cover in today's episode, so let's get underway. With the latest in news and analysis from the Pentagon to platoon, this is Defense News Weekly. Welcome back to Defense News Weekly. I'm Colin Demarest. Navy Captain Brett Crozier burst into the national spotlight back in the spring of 2020. It was the early days of COVID-19 pandemic, and the carrier that Crozier commanded, the Theodore Roosevelt, was suffering an outbreak in the middle of a deployment. Crozier, a helicopter and fighter pilot, sent an emailed plea for help up the chain of command out of concern that 5,000 sailors under his watch were not getting offloaded into Guam fast enough. But when that communication leaked to the media, the brass soon canned Crozier. More than 3 years later, Crozier is now out with a book titled Surf When You Can, Lessons in Life, Loyalty, and Leadership from a Maverick Navy Captain. The book takes readers through Crozier's long and varied career while noting the lessons he picked up along the way. Military Times reporter Jeff Zazulowicz spoke to the now retired Crozier about the book, his time aboard the Theodore Roosevelt, and moving on from difficult life events.
The book is Surf When You Can, Lessons in Life, Loyalty, and Leadership from a Maverick Navy Captain. Brett, why don't we start out? Why don't you tell us a bit about why you decided to write this book?
No, thanks, Jeff. Certainly put a lot of thought to even begin the process of writing the book, but I think it came down to really three reasons. One was to recognize all the men and women I had the privilege to serve with and sail with and fly with during my 30-year career. And I think in some ways it was writing a book to thank them personally for their efforts and all the stuff I learned along the way. I also wanted to share with the broader audience things that I learned during those 30 years. And I know, we all have stories to tell and see stories, but I thought that, I had the privilege of an incredible career, learned from a lot of people, and I wanted to share some of those stories, not just the families or around the I-bar, as we say, but with a broader audience, because I think that there's a lot the general public can learn about the military. And third, though, I think is important was to kind of dispel the myth that I was bitter or that I was disgruntled and leaving the military in a different state than I was. The TR episode is what it is, and we can talk more about it. But in the end of the day, I served 30 years in the military, and I enjoyed everything about it.
One of the most kind of iconic moments of your tenure and the end of your tenure on the TR is when you left the ship in early April after being relieved and you walked down the enlisted brow. You recounted in the book. We wrote about it. A lot of people wrote about it. Couple sailors videoed it, to the world's benefit to see that moment. But, thousands of sailors turned out, even in this, kind of murky COVID environment in terms of spread and stuff, and they all got in that hangar and they were, chanting your name, Captain Crozier, as you walked off the ship for the last time. Did you know that the crew was gathering to see you off like that? And can you kind of take us through what that final goodbye from your crew meant to you?
Yeah, no, I had no idea. In fact, it took me the better part of the day to pack up and make sure I was ready to leave the ship. I had been told to leave the ship by the end of the day by my boss at the time. I felt bad. That's the downside of leaving the ship. It's the idea that did I just die on a hill that I could have been around to fight later or not? And so I saw the second thing I think I saw from that or felt from that was their, not forgiveness, but more, Captain, we got it. We're going to continue to fight on. You trained us well. We've got a great medical department. So I felt comfortable in that, and that I felt like they weren't going to give up. They weren't despondent. They weren't sad. They were like, we're going to go fight. We're going to fight on, and we're going to fight on for you because this is an important fight ahead. And so those are the two big things I took, I guess, as I tried to take it all in and then left the ship for the last time.
In announcing that you wouldn't be reinstated, you went so back and forth. There was reporting in the spring of 2020 that they were going to reinstate you as CEO of the TR after they had relieved you. And then in the summer of 2020, CNO Gilday holds a press conference to announce that you would not, in fact, be reinstated. He said at the time, quote, speaking of you and Admiral Baker, the strike group commander, quote, "They did not do enough soon enough to fulfill their primary obligations, and they did not effectively carry out their guidelines." According to Gilday, the wheels were already in motion to secure beds for TR sailors in Guam when you sent kind of the red flag email that started this all. Gilday said, quote, "The email and letter sent by Captain Crozier were unnecessary. Actions were already underway." What do you agree with those contentions? Do you disagree? What do you say, to those claims?
Yeah, I guess I fundamentally disagree. I certainly think there was a lot of things in motion. There were a lot of courses of action being discussed, and do we move all the sailors to another base? Do we move them to fly them somewhere like Japan where we can get accommodations? And certainly the hotel rooms, which is what we ultimately used, were on the table. So I think the right way to say that was there was a lot of things in motion. There were a lot of wheels turning and a lot of plans. But I think those deliberations and the planning efforts had reached a point where, we were watching the positive cases grow exponentially. With a 2 months hindsight, certainly the things we could have done quicker. Yeah. But I think we were learning as we went, and we were erring on the side of caution in all cases, and we were trying to get folks off the ship as quickly as we could.
The book contains a great anecdote. I think it was July 2020 when the TR came back to San Diego. You were obviously no longer part of the crew. You were, reassigned to an airpac or Naval Air Force's readiness position, I believe. But you kind of got to witness your old carrier returning to San Diego in a unique way. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, so we were, again, working a great job there and keeping busy with Naval Air Forces. And, an old buddy of mine, old XO actually, he and I decided we were going to paddle out on stand-up paddle boards, just to kind of greet them. And not that from a carrier, you're not going to see a paddleboard unless it's in the way. So it wasn't to be.
And even then, possibly not, right?
And even then, possibly not. Especially in San Diego, they try to cut across occasionally. But yeah. So we went out and from a safe distance, but close enough to see the ship and see the sailors and see their faces as they manned the rails in whites to come back. And it was a great moment. It was a gorgeous San Diego day. Sun was out, super calm water, and we were able to get ourselves, there as they watched it come in the channel. And it, it was kind of the closed out that story for me, right? Is, the whole reason I sent the email to my superiors was to try to do what we needed, make sure we had exhausted all opportunities to take care of our sailors in that moment when we had COVID spreading pretty dramatically. So with the intent of getting them healthy, getting them back on the ship and getting the ship back underway so it could continue its mission. So to see it come back then, was kind of that, I guess that's what I wanted all along, just to make sure they made it back. Sure. And they did amazing things. And I think it's worth pointing out, to go from a dormant state, a carrier pulls in, you keep it, you sustain it pure side, you have to go through this battle with COVID, then you bring back everybody and you have to get the aviators current again. There were some unique challenges in how they did that, and they pulled it off pretty well, and they did it very safely. So my hat's off to them, from the medical team to the air department to the leadership on the ship that came in. Even, ultimately, Carlos Sardiello, who relieved me, he's a good friend, and he came back. I had relieved him initially when I took over command. He came back to help bring the ship back, and he did a tremendous job and did exactly what I'd hoped all along. Despite all the ups and downs, all I ever wanted was the ship to come back safely and pull back in, and to see them do that. And from a paddleboard, which I love being on the ocean, was not a bad way to see it come back.
Captain Crozier, thanks so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Shep. I appreciate the chance to chat with you.
And when we come back, Navy shipbuilding, the ins and outs of the Mammoth process, and what it means for the future of the Sea Service. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Defense News Weekly. The process of getting ships made for the U.S. arsenal is a lot like a carrier itself. It's big, complicated, lumbering, and often a little volatile. Decisions on what gets made, when, and how involve the Pentagon, lawmakers, and major defense industry companies, and how they work together comes to define the Navy's force structure and, ultimately, its sailors. For a look at the process and recent news in shipbuilding, Defense News' Megan Eckstein talked to reporter Bryant Harris about the topic. And here's some of what they had to say.
Bryant, thanks for joining me today. So you're the congressional reporter at Defense News, yet you travel down to the naval shipyards that I typically write about in the Gulf Coast. So what did you find out during your trip about the relationship between the shipyards and these lawmakers, and sort of how these new leadership positions may benefit the yards that you went to visit?
Yeah, so when I went down there, it was a congressional recess, and I wasn't expecting this when I made the trip. But the same week I was down there, there were a bunch of staff-level delegations to all these shipyards kind of making the rounds. So, you had a bunch of Senate staffers visit Ingalls and Pascagoula, Mississippi. They also went to Bollinger's new facility there, where they'll be constructing the polar ice cutter for the Coast Guard. You had a bunch of House staffers check out Austell down in Mobile. And, when I was in Eastern, Congressman Mike Waltz, he is a Florida congressman, but that's not even his district. He was visiting Eastern shipbuilding. So that kind of shows the increased focus or attention on Capitol Hill.
Certainly, and in my coverage of these yards, we've often seen congressional delegations down there where, it's not just the local lawmaker or the state senator, but they also bring with them Navy officials, Marine Corps officials, and there's really sort of this interesting dynamic of, the lawmakers taking ownership of these yards and wanting to show off what their workforce, what their people bring to the Navy and the Marine Corps. I've always found it really interesting to see kind of this relationship and sort of this ownership that they take of the yards in their states.
Well, you have a yard like Ingalls, for instance, which is, I think, Mississippi's largest employer. But all these yards in the region are competing for limited workforce pool. So, you have the typical incentives for elected officials to to promote jobs in their states. So they have their own interest. But the thing is, there's a very limited pool of labor to draw from in the Gulf, especially within the shipbuilding industry. They're also competing with industries like oil and natural gas. And I think there's a growing sense that this is probably the biggest capacity constraint the shipbuilding industrial base faces. So, one thing I saw when I was down there, a lot of these shipyards are poaching each other's workforce, and at the same time, they're all very focused on trying to draw more workers to the region, which is somewhat difficult to do. In your trips elsewhere to other shipyards, both in the Gulf and throughout the country, I understand this is like a pretty common issue. So, have you seen that elsewhere?
Certainly. And actually, if you look at certain lawmakers like Congressman Joe Courtney up in Connecticut, he has electric boat in his yard, and he's been very active. He actually sits not only on the House Armed Services Committee, but also the Labor Committee, and has really leveraged that position to help make some labor-related changes, education benefits for people to go to trade schools, the incorporation of welding and electrical work and those types of things into high school and college curriculums. And so you can really see where these lawmakers are obviously interested in the well-being of the shipyards, but they can leverage their position in Congress to make other changes to help support the yard and the workforce. So obviously workforce is a big challenge. Let's talk about the other challenge, which is sort of this tension between the Navy, the DoD, the Congress on what ships they want to buy and how many of these ships they want to buy. We have this interesting situation between the Navy and OSD where there's not necessarily agreement, particularly on the amphibious ships that are built down at Ingalls where you travel to. But ultimately, Congress gets the final say. Congress gets to decide how much money goes into the budget and what ships get bought. So what conversations did you have during your trip about sort of the role of making the case, not necessarily to the Navy, but making the case to congressmen for trying to get contracts awarded to these shipyards. And then also, I know there's obviously the yards all have their lobbyists in DC. Kind of what role are they playing in the background to really make this case to lawmakers who have the ultimate say in what ships get bought?
Yeah. Well, actually, I was talking to a lobbyist while I was down there who jokingly referred to like their conversations in DC as like the meeting of the 5 families from The Godfather. So, they're all competing, obviously, for contracts and even just like basic things for workers, but they're all very cognizant that, if, one shipyard tanks in the region, that's, at some level bad for their business as well. So they're all very cognizant of that. And honestly, they, at least the impression I get is they, another person told me, sometimes Congress tells the Navy what it needs, so what they need. So my impression was they're pretty confident that they don't want to take anything for granted, of course, but they do rely on these lawmakers from shipbuilding states to stop to help with programs that the Navy may want to end or pause in the case of amphibious ships.
And in other news, the Army's first new combat vehicle in nearly 40 years got an official name. The M10, now formerly known as the Mobile Protected Firepower Vehicle, will now be called the M10 Booker, after 2 soldiers killed in combat, one in Iraq and one in World War II. Staff Sergeant Stephen A. Booker was killed April 5, 2003 during the so-called Thunder Run in Baghdad, Iraq. Private Robert D. Booker was killed under heavy machine gun fire in Tunisia on April 9, 1943 during World War II. Stephen Booker was a tanker and Robert Booker was in the infantry. Robert was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor and Stephen was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The M10 Booker is an armored vehicle intended for infantry support, able to tackle suppression of enemy fortifications and entrenchments and return fire on opposing armored vehicles. General Dynamics Land Systems, which won the competition to provide the M10 to the Army in June 2022, will deliver the first of the vehicles in November this year. Don't go anywhere. When we return, our personal finance expert shows you how to make the most out of your military paycheck. Welcome back. On this edition of Money Minute, Navy Federal Credit Union personal finance expert Jeanette Mack gives you tips on making the most out of your military paycheck.
For anyone who gets a steady paycheck, it's critical to make the most of your hard-earned money. It's no different for service members. As a matter of fact, military pay offers ways to save that civilians don't have. Whether you're early in your active duty or a seasoned officer, it literally pays to take advantage of your military paycheck. As always, you need to save, save, save. The military makes this easier since you may not have to pay things like rent or utilities if you get your BAH or BAS. And you may get other stipends or bonuses depending on your job. Basic training is when most service members start the habit of saving, and the smart service member keeps it going until retirement. Once you're on the savings track, it's time to go the extra mile. Start to invest. Maximize your contributions to your thrift savings plan and match what the government is offering. It's easy money. Then talk to a financial advisor who can help fill out the rest of your portfolio within your risk tolerance and do what's best for your future goals. So use your military pay wisely, strategize like you would for any mission, and reap the rewards of a secure future.
Thanks, Jeanette. We'll see you next week. To get more coverage of military and defense topics, set those gun sights on Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps Times.com, as well as defensenews.com, and the home of all my coverage, C4ISRnet.com. And to be the most up-to-date paratrooper in the plane, sign up for our Early Bird Brief newsletter compiled each morning to bring you the latest headlines. It's also in audio. Check out the podcast version out each weekday wherever you get your podcasts. And if social media is where you get your news, follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. When we return, could the next battles in a high-end conflict be fought between satellites? Our discussion will explore just that, so stick around. Welcome back. Commercial satellite services and the signal data they provide are critical for military applications, including navigation, communication, and observation. Space-based RF data and analytics help provide military leaders with the information they need to make decisions. But adversaries can use commercial satellites too, as well as attack satellites used by the US. That means that the US must have a strategy for both offensive and defensive capabilities. Our recent Defense News webcast explored the many aspects of commercial satellite technologies and how they are helping to enhance national and global security. Here is some of that discussion.
Hello, I'm Courtney Albin, reporter for C4ISRnet. Thanks for sticking around for our next conversation, which will dive into the role of commercial satellites in enhancing national and global security. We have with us today Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Kimmick, Division Chief for the Cross Mission Data, Battle Management, Command, Control, and Communications, or BMC-3, for the United States Space Force. With his over 15 years of intelligence analysis and acquisition program management expertise, Colonel Kimmick has been responsible for delivering resilient and affordable space capabilities for our country. We're excited for this discussion, so let's jump right in. Hi, Lieutenant Colonel Kimmick, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, good morning.
In the last several years, we've seen kind of a significant increase in the number of satellites, many of them commercial, and the amount of debris on orbit, and that's projected to grow into the foreseeable future. Can you talk a little bit about kind of how that increased congestion and activity in space has impacted the work that your office does, and yeah, how that's changed in recent years because of that?
Yes, thinking back to a retirement yesterday that I attended with one of my aerospace colleagues. 10 years ago, we started the hosted payload office and trying to partner with commercial industry, building hosted payload interface units and trying to find ways where the military could partner with commercial spacecraft, and also looking at hosting government payloads on commercial spacecraft. And we did that actually about 10 years ago as sort of a pathfinder for proliferated LEO. So I think that was really the catalyst for where we are today and what we're seeing with the Space Development Agency. But take that forward about 10 years, and yes, we're seeing SpaceX constellations numbering in the thousands, SDA and others looking at space-based transport. And so certainly from our perspective, from an SDA perspective, how do we close gaps? How do we keep track of the ever-increasing number of our own spacecraft, as well as foreign spacecraft and enemy spacecraft? We have to rely on commercial. So we've certainly seen probably over the last 5 or 6 years, significant investment on the side of SDA from commercial perspective. So passive RF sensors, electro-optical sensors, again, ground-based, as well as other phenomenologies that are then selling that information to the government for the purposes of making sure we have a complete picture so we can keep track of the, again, ever increasing number of spacecraft. And then we're also seeing budding investment right now. There's a few organizations and a few companies that are looking at space-based commercial SDA. And so I think we're seeing significant investment right now in those capabilities so that we are not solely reliant on the systems that we build from a government perspective, but can also partner with commercial to maintain situational awareness. One of the challenges we see is, again, going back to the standardization and format capabilities that our legacy C2 systems expect the data to arrive in. We found as we went through a test case with 5 government-owned sensors, but sort of non-traditional sensors, AFRL capabilities, electro-optical telescopes. It's very manually intensive on our space defense squadrons to perform sensor calibration. So as we bring on, every sensor we bring on gets a unique identification number, and it falls on the space defense squadrons to perform sensor calibration and understand the quality of that data. We're trying to get to a point where we can automate that on their behalf. So the unfortunate aspect of bringing in non-traditional sensors that are government owned is that it increases the burden on the operators to actually ingest that information. So one of the challenges is, how do we automate that? How do we understand the quality of the information? Is it accurate? Is it precise? And we compare that to previous information we received from those sensors, and that decreases the workload on behalf of our operators. So again, I think we're pushing the boundaries here, and we're understanding and better capturing the challenges of bringing in additional sensors. And so automation is going to be a critical enabler as we go forward.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Please visit us on militarytimes.com and defensenews.com for more coverage. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.